Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. It's early afternoon here on the East Coast. It is a great privilege, and I mean it, to have Haviv Rettig Gur with us today. He's the chief political correspondent of the Times of Israel. He is uniquely in a place to describe the moment, what we call the constitutional moment in Israel. And what is at stake both domestically, and hopefully we can also touch on some of Israel's diplomatic relationships as a result of everything we're seeing. But this is an opportunity to really learn about the history, about the debate, and hopefully also an optimistic message, which I think I've heard Haviv share on some of his discussions in recent weeks. I think it's important for all of us to also be inspired about what might come in the future and not just be stuck in the moment now, although it is a very significant moment in the history of Israel. So without further ado, is Pascaline with us, Daniel? If not, Haviv, maybe I'll begin then and ask you the basic question that everyone is trying to understand. What is the debate in Israel? What is at stake? Who's right? Who's wrong? And if everyone is right, how do we figure out a way out of this crisis that we're in? Please, Haviv.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me. Really is a pleasure to be here, even if the reasons that we're all gathered here is that we're all very worried. Well, who's right? Obviously the journalists, whatever they're saying is correct. There are two sides to this debate, but there are really a few dozen different sides. And we know that a huge number of Israelis, a plurality, more than any specific camp, are actually somewhere in the middle. And that's, I think, part of the good news you referenced. There is the debate over the Israeli Supreme Court, but it's not really, I think, over the Israeli Supreme Court. The very fact that 10 months ago, only some think tanks, a few intellectuals, a few activists were thinking in any meaningful way about the Supreme Court as this foundational issue. And then 8 months ago, the whole country was on fire over this issue. The fact that that flip can happen so quickly tells me that the debate about the court itself is a proxy for other debates, for larger debates, for debates that are not just specifically about the specific powers of the court. I've also, been to protest against the many protests there have been against. I've been to a few, but also there were a couple of protests for the reform, and I've been asking ordinary people, also, neighbors, people on the bus, what do you think about the reform? What do you know about the reform? What part of it bothers you? What part of it do you care about? And, people are talking about constitutions and Supreme Courts and reasonableness clauses and standing and justiciability and all these new ideas that you used to have to go get a master's in legal theory to think about. Ordinary Israelis are thinking about and talking about. But then you say to them, well, what specifically is the problem with this piece of legislation? And they don't always know. That it is not that Israelis are now, if 1 in 4 Israelis has been at a protest, or 1 in 3, they're different polls, but they tell us that huge numbers of Israelis have been at protests. That's not because they have a good sense of the constitutional questions that are now being raised. It's because of something more fundamental. It's about trust, and it's about a sense that there is something happening negatively, something bad happening to Israeli solidarity. What an Israeli at a protest against the reform knows, and knows deeply and knows well, is that they don't trust the government, and they have a whole litany of reasons. And they don't trust the narrative on the political right that set up this judicial reform, instead of as a deep, complicated, cross-partisan discussion of how we live together, of our future, of our constitutional order, set it up as a kind of war of one side against the other. And then the other side, when you talk to supporters of the reform, you don't hear, well, I think the reasonableness clause is quite important because it's been used this way and that way by the court in the last 30 years. You don't hear the details. What you hear is, this court is unrepresentative. I am not on this court. The court doesn't understand me or see me. The court is a different ethnicity. The court is a different, there are Ashkenazim, and very few Mizrahim, for example, Jews from European descent as opposed to Jews from Arab world or Muslim world descent. And you hear a lot of that representation. And so there are this is a vocabulary for us talking about other much larger things, I think. David, I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Danielle, you had a follow-up question, and maybe we'll take turns. Go ahead, Danielle.
All right. So first of all, good to see you, Haviv. And so in that sense, do you think the Israeli society, with that kind of different fractures and divisiveness, is the Israeli society collapsing, or is it just growing up and going through a deeper process that has been going on for a few years that now is leading to a new era? Not necessarily about specifically that reform, but a new era within the Israeli society.
That's a great question. This is where I depart from a lot of the discourse right now in Israel that's very pessimistic and very frightened. I'm really profoundly optimistic. I'm not a little bit optimistic in the sense that it's going to be okay. Why is everyone so worried? I really think that every single question that we're debating now, every single question that's encapsulated in this fight over the Supreme Court, which is a question of, right, the problem is we have this, Israel has, and we can get into it, but Israel has this immensely powerful Supreme Court. There's no such court like it anywhere in the democratic world. The political right in Israel is not wrong on that point. But we also have, outside of that court, the simplest electoral and political system probably in the free world, with almost no checks and balances of any kind outside of just simple elections. And that fact that there's so little else is coming home to roost. In other words, if we weaken the court, the fear of everyone who isn't a supporter of this government or doesn't feel represented by this government is that nothing is left to protect me. There is no requirement of a second house with a veto or a president elected by a different cross-section of the population, or any of the things that we don't even have in Israel, a direct election of MPs. Most MPs are appointed to party lists. We don't have district elections at all. We don't have constituencies. The entire country is a single constituency. So most actually members of parliament are appointed to the Knesset by the heads of their parties, who are the government. In other words, the executive appoints the legislative majority in Israel. And so there really isn't anything, right? That is a huge gap in our constitutional order. It's kind of amazing. We've been a democracy all this time. We don't have the basic institutions that other democracies build out. And that was going to come home, right? We were going to have to deal with that. The questions of solidarity, the questions of the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox Israeli economy, and the lack of participation in the army or in any kind of national service. That was tolerable when they were outside the Israeli story. They were officially, in their ideology and their rhetoric, anti-Zionist. They were also 3% of the population. So it was not a relevant thing. Today, they're 13% of the population. And because they're 13%, they're claiming more and more of a right to be part of setting the decisions, making the decisions for everyone else. And therefore, it's no longer tolerable that other people are serving for them while they don't, or paying them to live without working, as half of the men in the Haredi community do. All of the questions that are being raised are old, and we have ignored them. And now we're facing them. Yeah.
If I may jump on that, I remember in the early mid-90s, there were a lot of predictions on the Arab community within the Israeli society. A lot of people were saying that they're growing massively due to obviously a high birth rate, and that during the early 2000s and even nowadays, there's going to be a huge majority of not working and et cetera, and unemployment. These predictions have come to fail because a huge part of these populations started to work and go to universities and now are part of the economy. What's your sort of prediction regarding the Haredi community? As you just mentioned, they're growing and they're feeling that they need to be part of the society. So within this context, how do you see the next 10 years?
Yeah, the Arab community is a great example. About half of women in the Arab community didn't work 10 years ago, and that was a cultural choice. And one of the ways that the government tackled that cultural choice was by creating incentives. So Arab women in 2012, I believe it was, the Netanyahu government, and Netanyahu himself spearheaded this, passed a negative income tax for Arab mothers. And so in the Arab community, mothers of, I think, 2 children or more, if they get a job, the government adds to their salary. That's a negative income tax. But to get that grant, they need to work because it's pegged to income. Otherwise, you can't get it. That alone sent something like sent a huge spike of Arab women into the workforce, and also drove a double-digit percentage of Arab households above the poverty line. Just that change in policy in 2012. These are highly susceptible communities to policy. Policy can change these trends. That's what's so frustrating about the Haredi community. How does the Haredi community maintain the situation where 50% of men don't work? Even as the community itself grows, the 50% is stuck. How do they do that? They have political parties that use their political influence to essentially transfer by force through the tax system money from one Israeli community to the other to allow them, no matter how big they grow, to not work. And that has created a tremendous amount of blowback. And what's really interesting to watch is that is not something that you should have to explain to conservatives, right? If the Israeli conservatives imagine themselves a kind of, having learned from American conservatives, you don't have to explain to American conservatives that literally the Bank of Israel has numbers in a report earlier this year that are a little shocking. It subdivided the net income from the net gain or loss from government funds. So all the taxes you pay and all the grants you get by religious identity. It did these big polls and it subdivided that data. And it turns out that on average, a secular household in Israel loses to the government about $500 a month. All the benefits they get, all the money they get, all the taxes they pay, they lose about $500 a month. Take a wild guess how much an ultra-Orthodox household on average gains from the government when all of the factors are factored in. About $500 a month. It's roughly 2,000 shekels to those asking about the shekel numbers in the actual report. In other words, there's just the Haredi community survives and gets to live the life that it chooses to live just through a forced transfer of massive amounts of funds from one side of the country to another. That was an issue that that we have to face. And it's an issue that when we face it, it's going to look awful. It's going to look unpleasant. It's going to be accusations. It's going to be questions of belonging. It's going to be questions of, it's a kind of abuse to take my money just so you don't have to work. It's not, these are not sick people. These are not hurt or elderly or, these are people who just literally think they should learn Torah at my expense, right? That is a feeling shared by vast numbers of Israelis, millions of Israelis. And at 13% of the population, the basic message I have is it's not that I think this isn't painful. It's horribly painful. It's not that I think these questions aren't fundamental. It's not even that I think that the nature and character of our democracy aren't at stake. They're absolutely at stake. This is what we're debating, and it's a good thing we're debating it. What I'm saying is, let's come at it from the other side of the question. Not, oh, is this painful? Is this difficult? Does this mean that we're in a point of struggle with our future? Of course we are. My question is, all of these problems that we're discussing, how is that conversation going to look? How is that going to be? What was that going to look like? When were we going to face this Supreme Court? When were we going to face the lack of any other checks and balances that make the center left right? The center left is right that if you weaken this court, our democracy is tremendously weakened because we need more institutions. This is what that was going to look like. And so this is that. And if this is that, thank goodness. Because you know what? In 15 years, it would have looked worse. It's time to face it. Right.
Very optimistic point right there. So in that aspect, where we're facing now that kind of that contest, the drafted bill that is about to be discussed in Parliament in the next session, how do you think that's going to go? Because we've seen in the past days in the media, the Haredi parties are not very much inclined to go under any concession regarding the drafting bill, and there's a huge crisis right now within the IDF, and I'd like to hear about your take on this as well. How is this going to go in the next few months?
Yeah, good question. The ultra-Orthodox parties have to pass a draft bill. They have nothing else on their agenda. They're the rabbis who give them their marching orders, and there are fewer and fewer rabbis who can give them their marching orders. The rabbinic leadership has weakened over the years. But in as much as there are rabbis who give marching orders to the political parties, this is the only thing they care about. All the other stuff they can compromise on. They have to get their yeshiva boys out of the military. and out of the yeshiva boards aren't in the military, but they have to guarantee that no court decision down the road will be able to force them into the military. And so how is that going to look? The Likud has said repeatedly this week, Netanyahu himself has said in interviews, member of Knesset Amit Halevi and I could probably come up with a dozen names right now who have talked about this just over the last week or two. They're terribly upset about it and worried about it. Likud doesn't want to pass a draft bill. For one thing, Likud believes in universal military service. For another, Likud wants to argue that the opposition is the one hurting the army, that the opposition threatening not to serve is a betrayal of our solidarity and trust in each other. But it's sitting on this giant albatross of the Haredi parties. And the thing they want the next session to be about is the draft bill. It's going to be hard to claim the opposition not wanting to serve as a problem if you're literally pushing through this Haredi thing. Netanyahu has asked them to drop it. The Haredi party's real problem, genuine political problem, is that this is their number one priority and has been for decades. And that's where we get into the deeper problem that we're facing. I mean, everything we've discussed until now is the deep problem. But the reason we're handling this really important, necessary, and I think therefore positive moment, in the sense that having that fight in a family is healthy if the alternative is not having the fight for another 10 years. The reason we're handling it so poorly is the crisis of leadership that we face. We need someone, and we don't have that someone. And it's certainly not Netanyahu. He's proven that he's not that leader. We need someone, and I say that not even as a partisan argument. I'm not sure Yair Lapid is at all, but he is not in the position of needing to be that person. Netanyahu is, and he hasn't been. We need someone to frame this moment for us. We need someone to come forward and say, look, at this moment when half of Israel we started this judicial reform, which we think is in principle justified, but the way we did it made half the country feel that we launched a war on them. We didn't. We don't want to. We want a democracy. So instead of just weakening the court and walking away from a basically demolished court, that was the original reform proposal, would just have erased the court, we're going to propose something not only moderate, but we're going to propose 6 other checks on our power that aren't the court. It could be a second house. It could be primaries required under law. It could be some way to rein it. There's a dozen options. We're going to pass a Bill of Rights that Israelis don't have. We're going to do something to show Israelis that we're Democrats. In the same exact way, this Haredi issue could be wonderful. It could be a wonderful thing, a wonderful moment. It's not going to be. It's going to be a catastrophe, but it could be. The Haredi community doesn't think its young men should go to the military, and that's a religious belief, and I respect that profoundly. Tell you a dark secret also. The army doesn't want them. The population keeps growing. The army doesn't need to grow infinitely. But the principle of national service, we've discovered over the last 3 months, as these volunteers in the military, it turns out the military has massively relied on huge numbers of volunteers from the secular center-left of Israel. It turns out the secular center-left cities like Kfar Saba, like Ra'anana, if listeners are familiar with Israel, these are significant suburbs of Tel Aviv. It turns out young people in these secular center-left cities join the military by 90% factors, like just by huge numbers. It turns out the Israeli left, we'll call it, for lack of a better term, it's a very diverse place, is the American conservatives' absolute fantasy of a conservative society, deeply patriotic, massively serving in the military. That is something that has to be preserved, and it has to be preserved by giving people a sense of fairness. And so how do we give the Haredim what they want, which is legitimate? It is legitimate to say, I can't serve in the military for religious reasons, but then you have to serve some other way. You have to serve in a way that other people who do serve in the military to protect you from real enemies, not theoretical ones, feel that there's fairness. And that is a leadership that we don't have, that is unable, our leadership right now is unable to launch that process. And that is a big part of the tragedy of this moment, but I think we're going to get over that. But the Haredim are going to have to explain to us what yes. We understand what no. Not all, secular Israelis respect it. I respect it profoundly. But then what yes? Why can a yeshiva bacher a yeshiva student not then volunteer in a hospital? Why can a yeshiva student not then volunteer in their own community, but show me that we have this larger process. And by the way, and then extend that to the Arab community and create new ways for Arab integration, solidarity, internal community cohesion. Israelis are some of the happiest people in the world. There's the UN Happiness Index that came out about 3 months ago. Israel's the 4th happiest country in the world. And we all started scratching the surface to find out why. Maybe Israelis are like lying on poles, right? Who knows? Like, what would it be? Like, how could that possibly be? And it turns out that one of the big methodological planks of that report is something they call social support, and generally social capital, as sociologists call it. Israelis have large families, strong communities, tight-knit, many children. Israelis live a life that hasn't yet been, in most Westerners, live far from family. Just the way the economy works, they move constantly. And there's a sense of loneliness in Western life that Israelis don't have. It's part of our Middle Easternness, our traditionalness. All of that is to say, the Israeli left has that, the Israeli right has that. And we have these tremendous strengths that I think are going to, in the end, see us through this and come and I'll stop there. I don't know where I'm going, but I had a very good point. But no, but really, these are, yeah.
So I'll take you on the sense of fairness. Let's say, and I'm taking your idea of their sense of volunteering and a sense of community, etc. And I'll take it and I'll flip it. And let's say that this happens. There's a new status quo that's being decided. The Haredi community is serving the community or the country in this way, and the reform stops, and we find some sort of leadership. Name it the way you want. Do you think, with the government still in place, that the protest will stop? Is that just about some sort of agreement, or is this a deeper crisis? Is this an anti-Netanyahu protest, like some of the media or coalition members are saying, or is it something deeper?
It's all the things all at once. My point about solidarity was just the Haredim could be taking part in that. By the way, the happiest of all Israelis are Haredim because they have the most tight-knit communities. That turns out is the happy life, the tight-knit communal life. And so they can be part of also a larger Israeli story in that way. The question of, what are the protests about? That's a very good question. They're extremely diverse groups of people. There's people who are quite right-wing at the protests. There's people who are very left-wing at the protests. And they're not always protesting exactly the same thing, but they're all protesting the sense that that I would almost say that the sense that this government doesn't care what it breaks. It is a group of people who have allowed themselves to buy into their own campaign propaganda, essentially. Their campaigns have said things, we have these books published in Israel in recent years on the right that are titled things like, why do you vote right but get left? And people talking about the deep state and all this kind of populist rhetoric, which always draws on some truth, but then takes it to a simplistic extreme. And if you try and actually run a country based on the way you posture in front of the cameras on a campaign, you end up with this government. And it's a government that, let's imagine that we are right-wing voters who deeply want this government on the things it claims to want, really wish it would accomplish it. We're probably as disappointed as the left because it has accomplished none of those things. And it's managed to set the country on fire in the meantime. So the protesters are united by a sense that this government, by a sense of distrust in this government. If this government, if Netanyahu, right, decides not to be beholden to the Itamar Ben-Gvirs, who can topple his coalition. Netanyahu has 64 seats out of 120, and Ben-Gvir has 5 seats. So Ben-Gvir can take away alone, the most extreme party in Israeli politics, can take away Netanyahu's parliamentary majority. If Netanyahu decides not to be beholden to Ben-Gvir and stands up and says, we're gonna bring real democratic, right, institutions, more institutions instead of less. We're going to weaken the court because the right is correct about that. But then we're going to do other things. I think half of the protesters go home. I do think that. It has to be real. It has to be believable. It has to be, this government has to earn trust, right? There's an old saying in the Knesset, To negotiate in politics, you need credit, but with Netanyahu, you have to get cash. He doesn't have credit.
I've heard this before somewhere.
Yeah, that's a thing he has done to himself. He doesn't get a lot of credit, and so he has to earn that trust. Let me take all that babbling and just pare it down. Imagine for a moment Benjamin Netanyahu gets up on national television and he says to all these angry and worried Israelis, my fellow Israelis, I am a Democrat, truly, lowercase d. He's definitely a Republican, but I'm a lowercase d Democrat, truly and profoundly. And I don't expect you to trust me, because if I expected you to trust me, I wouldn't be a Democrat. I will earn that trust, and I will earn that trust by showing you that I deeply distrust my own power, which is what Democrat means. Here is a Bill of Rights. He, by the way, back in March, when he stopped the reform, when the whole economy was shutting down essentially, because both the industrialists and all the industrial organizations and the labor unions were all going on strike after he fired the defense minister, he shuts down the economy, and he cancels, the economy is shutting down, so he cancels or freezes the reform, and he gets up on national television and he makes a promise in front of the whole nation. We are going to attach a Bill of Rights to this reform. So you know our intentions. I'm paraphrasing badly, but that Bill of Rights never came out. Nobody, what happened to that, right? If he gets up and he says, we mean it, we really want a democracy. This isn't a nervous tick of our activist base that hates the court because it's learned to hate the court, because you got to hate something for a campaign to work. This is real and deep. And here is the Bill of Rights. Here is the other check on power I'm replacing as I'm weakening the court somewhat to make it more.
So here's a question for you. My take is, obviously there's the media loves polls, right? And you need to take them with a grain of salt when there's no elections coming in the next weeks or so. But right now in the polls, it clearly shows that Netanyahu's government has no added value into going into elections. So you mentioned that Ben Gvir can topple his coalition, but it's clearly not in his benefit to do so. So Netanyahu should feel confident to do something like you just mentioned, because his coalition is very fragile right now due to the instability in the country. Why doesn't he do something like you just mentioned?
That's a fantastic question. He should be, I'll say more than that. When the government is low in the polls, it stabilizes. That's always true of any parliamentary democracy. That's how it works. Why would you face the voter when they hate you? Netanyahu also can't be replaced because of a rule we have called constructive no confidence, where you have to actually, the Knesset has to elect a different prime minister from within itself in order to topple the existing prime minister with a no confidence vote. And because you need a replacement prime minister, there's no one in the Knesset that anyone can see who would actually have those votes. And so Netanyahu can't actually be felt. He can have his parliamentary majority taken away, which means he can't pass bills, but he can't actually be toppled unless the Knesset fails to pass a budget in March 2025. So it's not that Netanyahu can be kicked out of office. He almost certainly can't. But what he can have happen is literally have the complete inability to do anything until the spring of 2025. And he doesn't want that. He is deeply reactive. He has reacted to everything. He let Yariv Levin lead the judicial reform as if it wasn't the central thing his government has done for the last 8 months. He has just on every issue, you name the issue, on the economy, he's been reactive. Israelis are facing massive inflation. Like many people around the world, the high-tech industry apparently lost about 90% of its investment over the last 6 months. Only some of that is the reform, some of that is the chaos around the reform. A great deal of that happened all over the world, but the NASDAQ is recovering much faster and the Israeli high-tech industry is not. And so there is some element of the crisis that is involved there. And so we're seeing a country that in 100 different ways is saying we need leadership, we need management, we need serious policy, and a government that is entirely reactive and a prime minister is entirely reactive for 9 months now. A lot of people who don't like him have written articles with headlines like, it's not the old Netanyahu. But what's interesting is the newspaper most identified with him, Israel Hayom, that has campaigned for him since the day it was founded, is writing articles like that now. And there's a real question, where is he? Where is the old Netanyahu we knew, who could just manage a policy?
Right. And before I ask you my next question, I want to remind our guests to please submit a few questions in the Q&A. So again, before I close my part, I'd like to ask you how do you see then the next era would be? Because we're all saying that the new Netanyahu is something that we don't know anymore, and so who's leading behind the scenes? Is that like the media likes to call it, like the Ben Gvirs and the Yariv Levins, or is there a fractured Likud? Is there something else upcoming in the next few years?
I think so. Let me say just one thing about Netanyahu not leading that's really important to say. This is a debate we're having in Israel. It's very clear that this government is not achieving its goals. Never mind, separately from the question of is the judicial reform good or bad, there's a simple question that almost none of it has advanced. And so that's the government's clearly not achieving its goals, whether you're right or left. That is a universally agreed thing in Israel right now. The question, the big debate is why is it not achieving its goals? And that's a debate that circles around Netanyahu. People who don't like Netanyahu argue that he is malicious. He wants to dismantle the court because he's on trial, and that created massive blowback. And now he has to deal with the blowback, and therefore he hasn't gotten anything done. And my argument that actually we're seeing weakness, not malice. This is he can't. He just literally can't. That's considered right now in the Israeli debate the pro-Netanyahu position. The pro-Netanyahu position is that he's trying but can't, and that's I think a sign of where he's at. It's a very interesting question. Could you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
So you said that the new Netanyahu we currently have, is not anymore what we used to see in all of his closer circle. So what's the next step? Is he gonna come back? Is the Likud going to a new era? Is it going to implode? What's the next steps within this kind of uncertainty within the coalition, within the Likud itself?
Okay. So there's the next steps in Likud, and then there's the next steps in terms of what happens with this government. Netanyahu isn't going to go anywhere unless he's forced to. That's kind of a basic thing we've all learned about Netanyahu over the last few years. The trial is not going to topple him. I think a colleague of mine at the newspaper actually counted the schedules that are allowed, the court is allowed to extend to him in his trial, and he has 2 appeals after this one, and he's going to be in power for 6 years if the thing that's going to topple him out of power is his corruption trial, and that's assuming he's convicted, which he could also emerge, without a conviction. He could be exonerated. So Netanyahu isn't going anywhere for quite a while. And then the question becomes, what happens with that? Where do we go with that? We have seen that Netanyahu has lost the capacity to attract large parts of the Israeli political right. The argument that political right has been making, people who are now parked in Benny Gantz's party in the center, if this is too into the weeds, I hope people forgive me, but there is maybe 15-20% of the Israeli political right, the voters, I mean, ordinary people, not just politicians, who are now sort of caucusing, so to speak, with the center left. And that's an anti-Netanyahu electorate that is right-wing on its views, but doesn't trust Netanyahu and is watching everything now and feeling validated. And apparently in the polls, we've seen that grow. In other words, the reason Netanyahu is, he has 64 seats in the Knesset, but I think he's polling at 52 seats in the bad polls and 56 seats in the good polls. That's about 5 to 10 more seats that have shifted away from this government out of a sense of distrust from right-wingers who just don't think this government is handling the big affairs of the day very well. Likud will need to recover from that. If Netanyahu goes to the polls without fundamentally changing something, and he can't fundamentally change something, there's no one he can pull in from the other side to replace Ben Gvir, to replace Smotrich. And if he can't replace Ben Gvir and Smotrich, then the West Bank continues to burn. The judicial reform continues in one way or another to advance. The protests don't die down, or if they die down, they come back every time they, these people say something unwise. The Saudi, normalization that Netanyahu considers his great legacy continues to, stumble along instead of really make a, move forward very quickly and easily. All the things Netanyahu really cares about don't happen, and he's stuck with these people. Not only that, as we approach the spring of 2025, as this government begins to see its time run out, and maybe it becomes unclear if it's capable of passing a budget with all its internal problems, we're going to start seeing a flip in terms of interests. Right now, because they're low in the polls, all the interest of all the parties is to stick together and stay in power, because if they face the voters now, all of them fall. But the closer you get to the election, to an election you can't avoid, right? You need to have your own campaign. Even if the government falls, you can't disappear. And so it suddenly becomes in the interest of people like Ben Gvir, of people even like Shas, United Torah Judaism, to have something to campaign on, to have someone to campaign against. Now, Ben Gvir's entire political existence has been as a critic, a far-right critic of the center-right. He has to run against Netanyahu. He ran against Netanyahu last time, saying Netanyahu is too left-wing and I'll pull him to the right and force him to stay right-wing. So he will have to manufacture a crisis that he can then leave the government on and then campaign on. And therefore, this government's going to fall, is going to not be able to stabilize the situation because of the right wing, its rightist flank. And then that rightist flank is going to have to campaign against it. And so they'll have to split early and be the thing that in the end topples it. That's what we're looking at right now. That's what Netanyahu, by the way, it's important to say, Likud strategists right now think that's what's happening. They're in this sort of dark corridor into a collapse, all of it because they don't have the numbers to avoid the far right. And they don't know how to get out of it. They don't know how to pivot out of it. All this talk over the last week, there's been a lot of talk in Israeli politics, mostly manufactured by Likud, little sort of trial balloons about a unity government because of the terrible crisis of Iran or whatever. They'll find a crisis. No one in the center left is even pretending to be interested, because the last crisis, right, COVID drove a unity government 2 years ago that Netanyahu then immediately undermined and destroyed and broke his promise, etc. So yeah, this government is stuck. Going forward, we're not going to be, no one's doing away with Netanyahu, and it's very hard to see how he climbs out of the hole that he's in right now, because he has to have a government that is dependent on these radical forces.
Right. On that very optimistic projection, I'll now turn to David, who has a question for you.
Yeah, Haviv, thank you again for this tour de force. It's really important for our followers to understand what's happening. I wanted to ask you about the pilots, the IDF, the security crisis. How deep is it? How irreversible is it? And what would happen if and when there is an extreme outbreak of violence with Hezbollah or Iran? Where do you see that process moving towards?
On the technical question of IDF readiness, I'm not an expert. I don't know how many pilots the IDF can afford to lose. I don't know whether it's lost them if they sit out a year of training and then come back. We're not talking about serving pilots. We're talking about volunteers who come in and help out and fly and volunteer for reserve duty. People the Army can't legally force to train or fly, but which it turns out the Air Force has been profoundly dependent on over the years. The readiness thing really made the news. A couple of weeks ago, I suggested that these people will fly, in a war, not because of what the judicial reform will be stopped or they'll think Netanyahu is better or worse, but just because they have to look their own kids in the eye when Hezbollah's 140,000 rockets start landing on Israel. You really want to tell me they're not going to fly? But then in the last 2 weeks, lots and lots and lots of friends started sending me these little gotchas, right? Because we're having this debate in Israel now between the army and the chief of the Air Force. General Baal said publicly, we're in a crisis. This is a crisis. Netanyahu was very angry that he said this, because he says, you're broadcasting to our enemies that we're in a crisis that's going to hurt deterrence. Stop talking, right? But are we actually in a crisis? I'll say it very simply. We have no long-term crisis. Every pilot is replaceable. If these pilots don't train for a while and therefore can never train again because the Air Force has these incredibly high standards, we're going to need to train a new generation of pilots quickly. We are in the best situation we have ever been, and frankly, facing threats that are not worse than they have been in the past. And so our Air Force, with much, much less, including in terms of manpower, has done vast and amazing things. But if this spreads and if it doesn't stop soon, then this could be a real problem, a deep problem. That's what Air Force people are telling us. That's what the Army is telling us. My reasons for optimism are not that it won't hurt, and they're not that it won't be a crisis, and they're not even that it won't literally bring the war, because Iran and Hezbollah will calculate that now we'll lose that war. I'm not saying that the bad things won't happen. I'm saying that the debate that we're having has to happen. If you can't politicize your volunteering in the military, not your enlisted service or your officer service, but your volunteering in the military, if that's not something that a citizen can say, hey, if this country really is going to be run by Itamar Ben-Gvir, I am not flying, then how can you politicize the other side of it? How can you politicize the Haredi side of it, or anyone who doesn't volunteer in any way? That's a question that has to be asked. And if that question hurts our military readiness for some short period, it still needs to be asked, and it's going to be asked. So long story short, the military question is larger than we expected. The question these people are asking, this is so fundamental to point out. It's not enough to get angry at them for politicizing the fact that they go to the military on a volunteer basis 1 day a week for 15 years, and it's the most central thing in their lives outside their families. And them politicizing something so deeply important to them is a signal from them that this really matters to them, and they feel a profound fracture. This is not a small elite, as someone wrote me. Somebody's moving their cheese, so they're getting all upset. These are people who have spent half their lives on this cheese, and it is not their cheese. It is a cheese they have handed all the rest. I think the metaphor is broken down, but the point is, it is something they've done for everyone except themselves. And they're saying this is getting hard to do. Now, it is still minor. I don't have the Army's numbers. I think they're state secrets. So I'm glad I don't have them. I can just blab. But a good friend of mine is a battalion commander in the paratroopers in the reserves, and he has had to put 4 soldiers on a minor court-martial for saying I'm not coming for political reasons, out of many, many hundreds, well upwards of 600. And so it looks like it's a small phenomenon still. The Air Force will still recover. It'll still fly. I believe most of these people will actually fly. They'll fly a little less well because they haven't trained in 6 months, but still they'll fly. And I'll take an Israeli pilot who hasn't trained for 6 months over anything Iran can throw at us.